And today we will start the discussion of the histology of the urinary system. The learning objectives for today's presentation that the students would be able to describe the external features of the kidney, macroscopic examination of the coronal hemisection of kidney, that you can define the cortex and medulla, what is nephron, collecting tubules and renal corpuscles, and you should be able to describe the blood supply of the kidney in detail. So up till here, these are the learning objective for today's presentation. Now the introduction of the urinary system, that we all know that the urinary system consists of a pair of kidney, a pair of ureter, a urinary bladder, and a urethra. The main functions of this system is the production, storage, and elimination of the urine. The definition of the urine: it is a fluid. The main component is water, but the waste products of the body like urea, creatinine, ammonia, uric acid, etc., these are present in the urine. Now this slide, it shows the location, some relations, external features, and the internal features that can be seen macroscopically. So the kidneys are two bean-shaped structures, and these are located retroperitoneally, that is behind the peritoneum, under the diaphragm. And this kidney, you can see it is covered by a connective tissue capsule, and this capsule is thin but tough. There is a depression on the medial side here, and this depression is called the hilum of the kidney. And in the hilum of the kidney, you can see the renal arteries are getting entry into the kidney, and the renal vein and the ureter, it leaves the organ. Now coming on this side, you can see the ureter, the upper end of the ureter is expanded, and it forms the pelvis of the kidney. Now, the pelvis of the kidney. Pelvic of the kidney, it shows extensions, a cup-like large and small extensions, and these are called the major and minor calyces respectively. Now in this freshly cut hemisection of the kidney, you can see here a zone which is the outer zone. This is called the renal cortex. Renal cortex. It is reddish brown in shape, and it is granular. Why it is reddish brown? Because the 90% of the blood which is flowing through the kidney at any time, this is present in this portion, and that is why it appears reddish brown. Why it is granular? Because the portion of the nephrons, those are present in this cortex. These are they are having their shapes like spheres or in a globular form. For example, the renal corpuscles, the convoluted part of the proximal and distal tubule. So that is why it appears as a granular zone. Now inner to this segment, this is the medulla of the kidney. Now this medulla, it is a striated zone with a light color. And why the striations are present in this zone? Because it contains the straight parts of the nephron and the straight blood vessels. That is why it appears striated. Why it is light in color? Because the 10% of the blood that is flowing through the kidney at any time is present in this region. That is why it appears light. Now you can another thing what you can appreciate here, that there are about 8 to 18 these pyramidal type things are present here, having this pyramid having the base facing toward the cortex, and this tapering portion, this is projecting into the calyces, minor calyces. Now this tapering portion is called the papilla. Some other things about this medullary section that you can see here. Some rays projecting from this medulla, these are called the medullary rays. How these medullary rays are formed? Actually, the straight part of the proximal and distal tubule and the collecting tubule. These are the three parallel running tubes that forms these medullary rays. And then you can, another thing that you can appreciate is this portion which is separating these medullary or the renal pyramids. These are the renal columns. So this is the extension of the cortex into the medulla, and this is represented by the renal columns. Now, some important definitions. That what is the lobe of the kidney? The lobe of the kidney is defined as this portion, that is this pyramid, along with the overlying cortex. It forms the lobe of the kidney. And another thing, what is the lobule of the kidney? Lobule of the kidney, because these definitions are important when you will study the blood supply of the kidney. You need these definitions. Now, the lobule of the kidney, this is the number of the nephrons present in the cortex that are served by a single collecting duct. So a single collecting duct serving the number of nephrons, it forms the lobule of the kidney. Okay, now we will move on to the other slide. This is just the repetitions what I have already told you. We can revise it now. The kidneys are two bean-shaped organs located retroperitoneally. Kidney is covered by a thin but tough capsule of connective tissue. On the medial side of each kidney, there is a depression called hilum through which renal artery enters and renal vein and ureter leave the organ. Upper part of the ureter is expanded, and this part is known as the renal pelvis. Renal pelvis has large and small cup-like extensions called major and minor calyces respectively. The kidneys filter the blood to form and excrete urine, regulates water and electrolyte balance, and also act as an endocrine gland. Now this is a picture again showing in this way you can see the ureter, the renal pelvis, the major calyces, the minor calyces, and here you can see the cortex, the renal columns, the medullary pyramids, and the medullary rays. And this is the diagram of the nephron of the kidney, and I will be discussing shortly later. And this is again the macroscopic examination of the hemisection of the kidney. That freshly cut coronal section displays two zones, outer reddish-brown granular zone called cortex. It contains renal corpuscles and convoluted part of the renal tubules. The inner striated segment of light color called medulla contain longitudinal arranged blood vessels and straight part of the renal tubules. Medullary region shows 8 to 18 conical masses called renal pyramids. Apex of the pyramids, known as papillae, projects into the minor calyx. Each renal pyramid with associated overlying cortex is known as a lobe of kidney, and the lobule of the kidney, the cortical nephrons draining into a single collecting duct. Then the renal columns are the extensions of the cortical tissue into the medulla. Medullary rays are the extensions of the medullary tissue into the cortex from the base of the medullary pyramids. Okay, now, what is the parenchyma of the kidney? That kidney is made up of what? It contains 1 to 4 million tubular structures called nephron and collecting ducts. The space between them is occupied by blood capillaries and interstitial connective tissue. This connective tissue is scanty in the renal cortex, but a bit more abundant in the medulla. The renal interstitium, it consists of mainly 2 types of cells and some collagen fibers in small amount. So what are the types of cells? These are the renal fibroblasts. They produced erythropoietin, which has got a role in the erythropoiesis, and medullipin. Medullipin first have to be converted into medullipin 2 in the liver, and then it acts as a vasodilator, so it lowers down the blood pressure. The other type of cells, these are the cells of immune system and the antigen-presented dendritic cells and few lymphocytes. Okay, now coming toward the main structural and functional unit of the kidney, that is a nephron. Now you see the nephron. What is nephron? Nephron is an epithelial lined tubes that begins as a blind tube from here, and then it ends by joining the collecting duct. So from here to here, this is all the nephron. Nephron has got we can divide the nephron into 5 segments. First segment is this one. This is the renal corpuscle. Renal corpuscle. Now what is renal corpuscle? Renal corpuscle consists of the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus. What is Bowman's capsule? Bowman's capsule is just the blind end of this epithelial lined tubes. And what is glomerulus? Glomerulus comprises of these capillaries which is present within this Bowman's capsule, and these are the looped capillaries. And the renal corpuscle, it has got 2 ends, a vascular end, a vascular pole, and the other one is the urinary pole. Vascular pole is that portion of the renal corpuscle from where the afferent arteriole is getting entry to feed these capillaries, and then the efferent arteriole is also emerging from the same pole, that is the vascular pole. Other pole is the urinary pole, from where the proximal tubule starts. Okay, now you see the proximal tubule, it has got 2 parts. First, the long convoluted part of the proximal tubule. Then it got a short straight part. You see the convoluted part, it is all lying in the cortex, and this is the straight part which is getting entry into the medulla. Now in the medulla, it leads to the this nephron loop, which is called the loop of Henle. And from the loop of Henle, it has got its thin segment and thick segment, and then the straight part of the distal tubule starts, that enters into the cortex. And then in the cortex, it forms this convoluted part of the distal tubule that ultimately leads to this collecting tubule, and then this collecting tubule joins the collecting ducts. Now this collecting tubule, actually this is the last part of the nephron, and collecting duct is not considered to be a part of the nephron. Okay, now here you can see what I have described in medullary rays. that it is the straight part of the proximal tubule. This one is the straight part of the distal tubule, and this one is the collecting duct. These are three parallel running tubes, and they give rise to these medullary rays, which is the representation of the medulla into the cortex. The other things you can appreciate here, that some parts, those are totally present in the cortex. These are the renal corpuscles. So renal corpuscles are all present in the cortex, and these convoluted part of the proximal tubule as well as the convoluted part of the distal tubule, they are all present in the cortex. And in the medulla, you can see that some portion of this straight part of the proximal and some portion of the straight part of the distal, and then these loop of Henle, all these are present in the medulla. And from here, these collecting ducts, it leads to the medulla, and it ultimately forms the papillary duct. Papillary duct, I have already told you, the tip of the pyramid. The medullary or renal pyramid, it is called the papilla, and it is the region from in which this duct, which is the papillary duct, it drains or pour its the fluid, that is the urine, into the minor calyces. Now this is again just to revise that each nephron is a long epithelial line tube that begins blindly and ends by joining a collecting duct. A nephron consists of 5 major segments: the renal corpuscle, that includes the Bowman capsule and the glomerulus. The proximal tubule means the proximal convoluted tubule and the proximal short straight tubule. Then the loop of Henle, also called the nephron loop. Distal tubule, distal straight tubule, and distal convoluted tubule. The connecting duct, these are the cortical collecting duct. Now, sometimes the term uriniferous tubules, when we use the word uriniferous tubule, it means nephron plus collecting duct. Now, depending upon the location of the renal corpuscles in the renal cortex, nephrons are classified into 3 categories: superficial cortical, mid-cortical nephron, and the juxtamedullary nephrons. Now, coming toward the blood supply of the kidney. Now you can see here that this is the renal artery. Renal artery is a branch of what? Branch of aorta. After entering into the hilum of the kidney, it gives rise to 5 segmental arteries. 5 segmental arteries on each side, in both the kidneys. That 5 segmental arteries are arising from the renal artery. Then the segmental arteries divide, and they divide to form the interlobar arteries. So these are the interlobar arteries. You see here, interlobar. Why they are called interlobar? Because they are present in between the 2 lobes. Lobe is represented by this renal pyramid and the overlying cortex. These are the interlobar arteries. On approaching the corticomedullary junction, these divide into 2 branches running parallel to the surface of the kidney, and these branches, these are called the arcuate artery. Now these are the arcuate arteries. Now from the arcuate arteries, the small vessels are arising here, and now these are passing in between the lobules. So these are the interlobular artery. So there is a difference between the interlobar and the interlobular arteries. Now these interlobular arteries, when these interlobular arteries, they turn laterally to enter into the lobules of the kidney, and then it gives rise to the afferent arterioles. And further explanation will be with the next slide. In this way, here you can appreciate. Now, this is the afferent arteriole. Actually, now this afferent arteriole is entering into the renal corpuscle, into the glomerulus, so to feed these looped capillaries, those are present in as a glomerulus, and from these capillaries then arise a efferent arteriole, and then this efferent arteriole is going to join a plexus of capillaries. Those are called the peritubular capillaries. So the peritubular capillaries. Now here you can see this is the sole example of the arterial portal system. I have already told you that the portal system it is the system which is present in between the two sets of the capillaries. Here in the glomerulus, there lies the capillaries, then the efferent arteriole, and then again these are the peritubular capillaries. So arteriole is present in between the two sets of capillaries. So this is the sole example of the arterial portal system in the body. Okay, now what happens to these peritubular capillaries? From these peritubular capillaries, small veins arises, and these are called the satellite veins. Why satellite veins? Because they are present in a form of star-like structures, and they ultimately forms the interlobular veins, and then it passes on to the arcuate vein, and then ultimately into the segmental veins and the urinary veins. Now, another thing which is I have to explain, that I have already told you. Now, so see here, these are the afferent arterioles enter into the renal corpuscle, from where the efferent arteriole is arising and going to form these are the peritubular capillaries, and then I have already told you that these are going to form the satellite veins, then interlobular veins, and the arcuate veins, and the interlobular veins, and then they can reach to the as a segmental vein, and ultimately the renal vein. But what happens here in these renal corpuscles? The efferent arterioles from in this region, which is the just the juxtamedullary region, here the efferent arteriole is not forming, is not going to these peritubular capillaries. Instead, they pass into the medulla, as a straight vessels in the medulla, and these are on coming down, they give rise to small hairpin turn type vessels, and it is going to join this vein. And both these systems, that is the system which is coming as a arteriole recta and then the venule recta, in combination these are called the vasa recta. Now these vasa recta, or this vein, it enters into the interlobular vein, and then they join this arcuate vein, and ultimately then it comes out as the renal vein. So some differences there in the upper part of the cortex and in the lower part of the cortex in the drainage of the blood out of the kidney. Okay, now I can show you some flow chart. You can start from here. You know, the this is the renal artery branch of the aorta, and then it gave rise to segmental arteries after entering into the hilum of the kidney. Then these are the interlobar arteries present in between the various lobes of the kidney, and then they form the arcuate artery at the corticomedullary junction, and these are present parallel to the surface of the kidneys. And then they give rise to interlobular arteries. Interlobular arteries that give rise to the afferent arterioles, then entering into the glomerular capillaries. From the glomerular capillaries, the efferent arteriole is arising, and it ultimately leads to the peritubular capillaries or the vasa recta, depending upon the site in the cortex. And then they lead to the formation of the interlobular veins. Interlobular veins drain into the arcuate veins draining into the interlobar veins. They are entering into the segmental veins, and they lead to the formation of the renal vein, and renal veins enter into the inferior vena cava. Now, what are these? These are 5 vascular segments of the kidney. I have told you that after renal artery getting entry into the hilum, it divides into segmental arteries. So there is a fixed number. These are the 5 segmental arteries. Why 5 segmental arteries on each side in both the kidneys? 5 segmental arteries, because they represent these 5 vascular segments of the kidney. You can see in the various views. Here in the posterior view, you can see the apical segment, inferiorly the inferior segment. On the posterior aspect, you see this posterior segment, and on the anterior side it divides into superior and middle. So there are 5. Okay, now coming on the lateral aspect. In the lateral aspect, we again can see the apical, and then the posterior side, the posterior segment is also visible here, and the inferior, and on the anterior side, superior and middle. Coming on the anterior side, we can see the apical, superior, middle, inferior. Posterior is not visible because it is present on the posterior aspect. So now you can well understand the blood supply, renal blood supply, right from the aorta up to the inferior vena cava.